All right, we need more stuff from across the pond.
Tell from the sweat pouring down my forehead, the UK is experiencing an unprecedented heat wave. Wales has registered its hottest day on record, hitting 37.1 degrees Celsius in Scotland. Temperatures hit 31.3 in a boy. That's only 1.6 below its record. And Northern Ireland experienced 31.1 in Derrylin, only 0.2 below its record, which was recorded last year. But England scored the highest temperatures. The mercury hit 38.1 at Santon Downham in Suffolk, just 0.6 degrees below its record, which was measured in 2019. The effect of the heatwave, of course, has been very real. Hospitals have cancelled operations, flights have been grounded, and the heatwave could lead to significant casualties. Indeed, the government's former chief medical advisor, Sir David King, has warned that the 2 hottest days of the heatwave could result in 10,000 excess deaths. So it's clear why the UK Health Security Agency has issued a red warning for this heatwave. The first time ever such a warning has been made for extreme heat. Yet despite all this, Boris Johnson doesn't seem too fussed. He's missed multiple Cobra meetings to address the record temperatures and instead has spent his time having parties at Chequers and doing this. That was Boris Johnson flying in an RAF Typhoon. He's clearly keen to rinse all the taxpayer-funded freebies he can get during his last 2 months in office. Who wouldn't? Although, I mean, if you're Prime Minister, you probably should attend those Cobra meetings. Boris Johnson, for his part, is not getting pressure from his backbenchers to take this more seriously. In fact, quite the opposite. Conservative MP John Hayes told The Telegraph, "This is not a brave new world, but a cowardly new world where we live in a country where we are frightened of the heat. It's not surprising that in snowflake Britain, the snowflakes are melting. Thankfully, most of us are not snowflakes."
He composed this message while sitting in his car with the air conditioning on full blast. He's been living in his car the past couple days.
John Hayes has been given a £50,000 salary by an oil company since 2018. That's according to the Parliamentary Register, which
we'll watch it tomorrow.
Could have something
posted in
to
the
do
news
with why he
content
seems a little bit dismissive of climate change. Right-wing journalists are also responding through oppositional lens. Ahead of the heatwave, this is how Bev Turner of GB News questioned the meteorologist John Hammond.
By early next week, you can scrap 20 degrees. It could well be 40 degrees. I think there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of excess deaths early next week. The charts that I can see in front of me are frightening. So we all like nice weather, but this will not be nice weather. This will be potentially lethal weather for a couple of days. It'll be brief, but it'll be brutal.
Oh,
so,
John,
we can
So, John, I want us to be happy about the weather and every single. I don't know whether something's happened to meteorologists to make you all a little bit fatalistic and harbingers of doom, because all of the broadcasts, particularly on the BBC, every time I've turned on anyone's talking about the weather, they're saying that there's going to be tons of fatalities. But haven't we always had hot weather, John? I mean, wasn't the summer of 76? That was as hot as this, wasn't it?
No, and we are seeing more and more records, more and more frequently, and more severely. Some people always hark back to the summer of 76, which was a freak event 40-odd years ago, over 40 years ago. But heat waves are becoming more extreme. This is yet another one which is coming down the tracks towards us. And, I don't think we should be too light-hearted about the fact that many are going to die early next week because of the heat. 40 degrees, the sort of temperature that this country, I'm afraid, is just not geared up to cope with.
That was incredibly embarrassing television. For a hopefully more productive discussion than you'll find on GB News, I'm joined now by climate scientist Dr. Ella Gilbert. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
To kick us off, we keep hearing this reference to 1976. I know it's before either of us were born, but as a climate scientist, can you tell me the significance of that? Why are all these people who are trying to diminish the significance of this heat wave talking about that year?
So 1976 is often kind of trotted out by climate deniers who like to look through rose-tinted glasses and remember a time where we just had a nice summer and it was hot and nobody minded. So 1976 was undeniably quite a warm summer. I think the maximum temperature was just shy of 36 degrees and it was very long. However, the main difference between what we're seeing now and 1976 is, first of all, that 1976, it was mostly just the UK that was really hot. The rest of the world was kind of average temperatures. In contrast to 2022, where you look at a map of the difference above what we consider normal for the time of year, and almost no part of the globe is not above average temperatures. So we're seeing heat waves obviously all across Europe with really devastating temperatures, well above 40 degrees in many countries, but also all over the world. We're seeing it in the Arctic, the Antarctic, North America, South America, Europe, you name it. It's very widespread, this heat. And of course, 40 degrees is warmer than just shy of 36 degrees. So it's a false comparison, I would say, but it's often used to try and distract from the idea or
wait, they just go, hey, we had another year that was really freakishly hot, therefore don't worry about this year? That's the argument that conservatives are making now? Like, listen, it got really hot 40 years ago. Ignore that, like, the last 10, the hottest years, 10 years in record, or like all of them happened in the last 10 years. Like, what?
Message that climate change is intensifying extreme events. It's making them hotter, it's making them longer, and it's making them happen more frequently.
Is this in line with what was expected, or is this hotter than what sort of the mainstream climate models were suggesting we'd be seeing by 2022?
Interestingly, a couple of years ago, the Met Office did an exercise where they tried to put together a kind of hypothetical forecast for the 2050s. And I think the top temperature on that chart was 40 degrees. So if you compare the actual real weather forecast with that hypothetical forecast for the 2050s, it looks remarkably similar. So although this is a really unprecedented event, and this is a very freak occurrence in terms of what we've already seen, it does appear like the kind of changes we were predicting for the 2050s are starting to manifest themselves now.
I don't know the details of that projection. Were they potentially saying that in 2050, this is going to be the norm? So your standard weather forecast will show that it's 40 degrees every day. And now we're just getting sort of like a taster of it with this sort of one-off, or am I getting the wrong end of the stick?
I wouldn't say that it would be the norm in 2050, but it would certainly be true that we would have heat waves, whereas a heat wave in our current climate might be a 30-degree heat wave. By the 2050s, it might be more likely that we would get 40-degree heat waves. We know that by the end of the century, if we keep kind of going on the track that we're going on, whereas at the moment 40-degree days are so unlikely that they would happen maybe once every 300 years or something like that. By the end of the century, if we keep going as we're going, it could be more like every 15 years. And it's better than the worst case scenario, which would be 3 to 4 years. But it all depends essentially on what we do now to curb emissions.
Now, as you've already mentioned, it's not just Britain being hit with this extreme heat. And one of the consequences across Europe has been wildfires. This footage was taken from a train in Spain.
What's he doing?
An incredibly terrifying, apocalyptic image. I mean, I should reassure you, no one was hurt on that train, but just it's an image that doesn't portend a particularly promising future. Ella, who's being hit hardest by these increasing temperatures?
So as with many extreme events, unfortunately, it is the most vulnerable people, the most marginalized and the poorest in our society that are feeling the worst effects of this. So in the UK particularly, it's the very old, people with disabilities or existing health conditions, or the very young. So anyone who's susceptible to cardiovascular or respiratory complaints, then they're particularly at risk.
Internationally as well, in terms of across Europe or this particular heat wave, where would you least like to live right now?
it's always going to be the poorest and most marginalized people who feel the worst effects. It's the people who are least able to cope with and adapt to these sorts of extreme circumstances. If you live in a country where temperatures are currently topping 45 degrees and you don't have access to cool spaces, air conditioning or shade, or you're being forced because you have to make money to work in the hot sun outdoors all day, then you're going to be much more at risk of having some negative consequences as a result of the heat. So it's both within countries and across the world, it's always going to be the people who are poorest or most marginalised who are feeling the worst effects.
Well, in Europe, it's extremely hot. I was just looking at Vienna weather, and it's today it was 96. Tomorrow it's going to be 96, and then Friday it's going to be 99. These are temperatures that are really unheard of in Europe. Like, these are crazy high, and it doesn't get below 90 till next Wednesday. That's fucking crazy. That's absolutely terrible. Madrid was 108. Holy fuck. And this is what our media still looks like.
Many people accuse me of being a climate change denier, which I'm not. I know that we've got to adjust the way we run the world and the way we live in our own societies, because climate is changing, but it's not changing for one reason only, the one reason only being how wicked man is to set fire to the planet in all sorts of different ways. And the reason I think Prince Charles has been so effective is because he's a moderate, and he's talked gently about it and quietly and slowly. You know, he hasn't gone out onto the streets and started gluing his face to tarmac, and he hasn't been pushing big pink boats through city centres and stopping people going about their everyday life. So more people listen to Prince Charles when he speaks than listen to all these, eccentric people who go around trying to stop the world from moving and causing pollution, all that kind of stuff, than listen to Prince Charles. Prince Charles has done a good job, but I do not believe that the climate crisis is only man-made, and I believe that net zero target 2050 is a completely ridiculous target which will ruin all our lives if it's ever achieved.
Judging on Ash's face, I think she might have a little bit to,
I think she would, yeah.
Might have a little bit to say in response.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, sometimes when I do this job, I wonder if even participating in the media is the right thing to do, because we somehow manage to have the stupidest possible conversation about the single most serious issue that's facing us as a species. 2050 is too late. All right, there's a reason why the UN climate reports are saying that we've got 10 years to take meaningful action. And actually, if we had taken action in the 1970s, in the 1980s, even in the 1990s, we wouldn't have to make such drastic adjustments to how we live our lives. It's because we've wasted all this time having totally pointless arguments, talking about the methods people use to raise awareness rather than the thing they're trying to draw our attention to, that we've ended up, I think, in such a dire position. I mean, we're struggling in 40-degree heat, but by no means is Britain the worst affected.
But this is the hottest day ever, so that's why we're struggling.
Where my family are from in Bangladesh, you have thousands of people dying every year because of arsenic poisoning. The reason why there's arsenic poisoning is because they're having to dig up so much earth to build dams to stop the sea levels rising and coming up the delta. Right? That is a reality that's people are facing right now, and instead we are going on about gluing faces or pink boats rather than going, hang on, what's the issue and what needs to be done about
Ash,
it?
I mean, basically, Ash, you are agreeing with Charles here. We should have listened to him, but he started talking about this when he was 21 years old, about plastic pollution. So you're actually agreeing with him.
We should have listened to the scientists who are sounding the alarm, the environmental activists.
You agree with the royal family? Wow, a leftist like you, a Republican? We use it in the sense of getting rid of royal families. And when you say Republican, chat, you mean getting rid of royal families, and you mean getting rid of the aristocracy, landed titles, etc. Not Republican like Republican in America, which they're trying to enact it again. Right back.
Charles, who said, well, look, Charles was one voice in a chorus, fine. I've got problems with his use of helicopters, private jets, whatever, but this isn't about an individual. This is the fact that we have a media conversation which props up billionaire and oligarch polluters and allows them to get away with boiling our planet to a crisp just to make a few people richer.
Is it only man who is, damaging the planet? Is it not meteorological considerations as well? The fact that the Romans were able to...
This is what I mean by having the stupidest possible conversation. We don't have control over sunspots. We have control over how much fossil fuels we burn.
Yeah, but sunspots happen. And sunspots, funny you should mention that, I was going to bring them up, affect the climate of the Earth.
And
there was a mini ice age. There was a mini ice age between 1300 and 1600, right? The Romans grew vineyards on Hadrian's Wall. It's cyclical. It is cyclical.
I mean, what you're doing is effectively defecating in the public swimming pool of the national conversation and trying to muddy the waters.
No, I'm not. I'm putting facts forward.
This is stupid.
I'm not. I'm putting facts.
His facts. I'm putting facts. Shut the fuck up.
Forward. They are facts, right? And you totally ignore them. You won't respond to me talking about olive groves in Northumberland or the Ice Age, 1300
because
to 1600.
That's got nothing to do.
It's got everything to do with it.
Before one of you starts gluing yourself to something, back to Charles, which is what we were talking about.
Was Charles right all along? I mean, Prince Charles. Ugh. Can you imagine having record-breaking heat in your country and going, was Prince Charles right? Fucking hell, dude. And this is what's happening here in the States.
Now to what some tonight are calling a looming environmental nuclear bomb in Utah. The mighty Great Salt Lake is drying up, and as the majestic lake slowly but surely disappears, there's major concern not only for the wildlife that relies on the lake, but for people living in Salt Lake City and what it might mean for the air there. Arcana Whitworth files this in-depth report.
Great Salt Lake, the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere and the 8th largest freestanding lake in the world. But what used to be a boater's paradise and a safe haven for wildlife is now a looming ecological disaster. Climatologists blaming unrelenting high temperatures and a record western drought made more severe by climate change.
The Great Salt Lake is drying out?
Being blamed for the lowest water level ever seen in Utah's Great Salt Lake. The lake now just 1/3 its usual size and shrinking weekly.
It's a little deceiving. This looks like a lot of water, but in fact, I'm standing in just a few inches of water. And under average lake conditions, I would be completely submerged and you wouldn't be able to see any of this land surrounding me. Instead, 2/3 of the lake bed has been exposed.
That's nearly 800 square miles exposed. That's larger than the Hawaiian island of Maui. And the once desert oasis now potentially an environmental disaster with national and global implications. As the water goes down, the salinity goes up, killing the algae, which feed the brine shrimp, which feed more than 10 million birds that depend on the lake during migration.
What would it mean for these birds to not have this lake?
You don't have a stopover point. So they've got to get from central Canada to central Argentina or southern Mexico without a stopover. You just can't do it. You have to refuel somewhere in the middle.
As more land is exposed, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the birds to nest and find refuge.
And they're no longer safe from predators like a coyote anymore.
Correct.
Because the coyote can just walk there.
Walk there.
Did you think you would ever see something like that?
I hoped not to, but we are where we are.
And it's more than just dry land that concerns state officials. It's what's lurking in the dust. As a terminal lake, nothing flows out, including toxic particulates, both naturally occurring and from decades of mining in the area.
The Department of Natural Resources says that sequestered here in just a few inches of water are harmful particulates. So if this dries up and this wind kicks up, they will be airborne.
It's very personal to us, and air quality.
Yeah. Well, at least the Gulf Stream blows east. What's east of Utah, chat?
Remains at the top of issues for Salt Lakers over the last several years.
The area is prone to dust storms that could have the potential to be hazardous for the state's most populous city.
There's lots of toxic minerals, but the one that will capture most people's attention is arsenic. In the wintertime, we get what's called winter inversions. It traps any particulates.
In the air.
In the air, yeah.
It's like putting a lid on, kind of,
exactly. Right? As our winter storms come through and whip up some of this toxic material, i.e. arsenic plus many others actually, that's going to be deposited over into the Wasatch Front.
You're telling me that if the lake bed is dry during a winter storm, things like arsenic could be in the air for anybody in Salt Lake City.
Right.
And the surrounding areas.
Yep, and trapped under the inversion.
What does that mean for people that live there? What kind of health problems could they experience?
Well, respiratory and cardiovascular. If you're compromised on any of those fronts,
Salt Lake City already has very terrible air quality. This is just a win for Republicans. The arsenic will deliver more brain damage to the population. I thought arsenic was a respiratory suppressant.
I don't know how much time we have.
Joel Ferry, a fifth-generation rancher and newly appointed executive director of natural resources for the state, has been sounding the alarm bell for years. Under his guidance, farmers and ranchers who use 65% of the area water to produce the state's top commodities, like livestock, hay, and grain crops, are making small changes with a big impact.
So that's called drip tape, and it's a little hose that gets buried. And what it does is it just pushes water in a small row right where the plants are. Drip irrigation will save 50-60% without managing our water appropriately.
That sounds like a goddamn regulation. I don't think I want to do a goddamn regulation, you fucking goddamn communist. I will use my water as I see fit, you communist. Stop regulating me.
Life in the West doesn't exist.
Joel's land is on the Bear River, the largest tributary to Great Salt Lake.
It looks like it's hardly moving.
Yeah. And a lot of years it's like this. The drought, though, has made it so much worse. So the Bear River is not getting the big flows down to Great Salt Lake to raise those lake levels. Normal cycle, Great Salt Lake goes up 2-3 feet and drops 2 or 3 feet. The last number of years, it's only gone up a foot. This year, it only went up a foot. So it's going to go down 2 to 3 feet. That's why we keep hitting these record lows. And the problem is, it's a shallow lake. There's not many more feet to go.
He says conservation alone won't be enough. They're looking at generational investments from the state and federal government.
Can they save Great Salt Lake?
They will have to.
And Lindsay, those airboats we were on were the only boats we could use to get out on the water because they can operate in just a few inches. Because as you can tell, this is what a lot of the lake looks like. I'm actually walking right now in the Antelope Island
I'm breathing
Marina.
in the arsenic
right now.
now.
Back here, you can see all of these empty boat slips. Now, they actually had to take most of the boats out of the water last year, and this year has been the third driest year in state history. And so that is forcing leaders to say things like conservation alone is not enough. They have to consider drastic measures like piping ocean water in to save the Great Salt Lake. And Lindsay, they think it could work because we have to keep in mind the Great Salt Lake itself is actually 5 times saltier than the ocean.
Just incredible images, perilous times. Kana, our thanks to you.
Gonna send in, they're gonna bring in. Yeah, there's no way that's gonna cause any problems of introducing species and all sorts of shit that are not part of that. Listen, Chad, I'm not trying to have doomer days, okay? Desalinate and then send the brine to Utah. Oh, damn, we got ourselves a goddamn genius with Sushi Bomb. But wouldn't the brine be even saltier than that? Like, isn't brine like way salty? We just find ourselves we find ourselves a little bit of a solution here. Capitalism wins again. No drip tape. Are you watching the stream unsubbed? You're making income inequality worse. You are doing anti-praxis. We are the only Twitch stream that will not accept scam advertisers, and I will never fuck you over by selling you crap